put you there.
So I'm gonna always be there.
You can move it.
So, all right, morning art fundamentals. The day before a snowstorm, we're back at this situation, including me in the corner, and I'm looking at the screen because I'm telling the other half of your class what's going on, and here we go. So here we are in person. So I would expect you, like every day, every time, bring your portfolio with the materials, what we've been doing, because we're not only finishing up our value texture landscapes today. I'm going to give you time to do that at the end of this, but also you could start this next thing, which is color theory part 1, 2. So the value texture landscape drawing, in case you're not sure what I'm talking about, this, which is not clickable, which is clicking. Hide. This guy, I'm talking about this. This is due technically Wednesday. So that's when I'm going to ask you to drop it into a Padlet post. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should talk to me after this, and they should be full, and there should be 5 layers minimum. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She's got 6. So long story short, that's that. And how do I go back? We will find out. So that's what hopefully, if you don't have done, you should definitely get down on that today after I'm done here. Meanwhile, let's talk about this assignment. So I just also, before I go into that though, I alluded to Wednesday's Padlet meet, and that is this right here. So let's check it out. It's pretty simple. This week's Padlet, I'm just asking you, like every week, but this is going to be a finished landscape or cityscape or whatever scape is going on. This is where you'll drop it and then make a comment on 3 people's work, giving them a sandwich of good, bad, and beautiful. So that's that Padlet. So that's Wednesday for free and easy points. And if you're like, even if you're not done with it, I would drop it on there for the record. Even if it's half done, at least I'm like, okay, you get your attendance. It's 25 out of 25, easy. And then you can technically finish it all through. I don't care if it's done by Friday, you know what I mean? And you could resubmit even and delete that if you had to. I usually don't do the attendance for that until about Friday afternoon or the weekend, just because I let people keep chugging or putting things in there. Next class, you're going to bring your materials with you and your color theory watercolor paintings. So that's what we're talking about. Part 1 of this. Watercolor theory. So let's talk about it. Let's go over it. This is your next big assignment. It's going to take you right to February break, which is only 2 weeks away, believe it or not. Today is February 1st, 2021, and in 2 weeks February break starts. So this is going to take you right to that. So if you don't get done with that or anything, you have the break to work on it technically. But if you don't want anything to do over break or not to worry about this, then get it done in the next 2 weeks. The big picture is this. Down here at the very bottom, here's the examples. You are going to make 2 watercolor paintings of landscapes or cityscapes or any kind of escape, the same one twice. One has to be warm colors and one has to be cool colors. And these are examples of student work from last trimester and last year. So, you can see hopefully the clear distinction between warm and cool. And let's talk about that a little bit. I wish I could hide this. I'm going to hide it. Good. So the big picture, well, I'll just back up. Let's talk color here. So you're going to learn about the elements of art. Color. You're going to use watercolors to make that, that painting I just talked about, and understand color's ability to convey mood and expression. One of my classic vids. Let's do it. Whoops. Thought I had it.
A lot of representational art attempts to portray the world realistically by mimicking 3-dimensional space and attempting to faithfully render objects as we see them. However, many artists embrace a different reality. So-called color field painters of the 1950s and 60s wanted to reinforce the idea that the painted canvas is a flat, 2-dimensional space. They made enormous, large-scale paintings that were often comprised of just one or two colors. Their art didn't represent the outside world or try to take you to another place. It reinforced the fact that you're looking at a painting. The bold, bright colors they used weren't meant to represent anything else. For them and the many artists they inspired, color is a beautiful and worthy subject all its own. Color is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, shape, form, texture, value, and space. When light hits an object, some of it is absorbed and some of it is reflected, depending on the materials the object is made of. The light that is reflected off of the object is what we see as an object's color. Red, yellow, and blue are called primary colors because they cannot be made from the mixing of other colors. However, the 3 primary colors can be mixed together to produce nearly every other hue imaginable. Green, orange, and violet are the 3 secondary colors. They are created by mixing 2 of the primary colors together in equal amounts. When you mix a primary color with a secondary color, you get a tertiary color, such as red-orange, blue-green. Every individual color can be altered by changing its value through tinting, shading, and toning. Tint is simply any color with white added to it. So red becomes pink, blue becomes light blue, green becomes light green, and so on. A shade then is created by adding black to any color. Adding black and white to a color produces a tone. Sometimes a work of art will be made up of the tints, shades, and tones of only one color. This is what we call a monochromatic color scheme. One way artists personalize their work is by creating their own very unique colors, tints, shades, and tones. Notice how the violet colors in this print by Anish Kapoor differ from the ones used by painter Morris Louis. Is there one that has more tinting or shading than another? What do you think is creating the difference? One common way people categorize colors is by temperature. Reds, oranges, and yellows are referred to as warm because they can be easily associated with a warm, sunny day. Blues, violets, and greens, on the other hand, are called cool because they often come to mind when thinking about overcast or rainy days. When cool and warm colors are mixed together in a painting, what is the overall mood or feeling then? Besides the weather, there are many other associations and feelings that colors can summon. Is there a color or a combination of colors that triggers a specific memory or thought in you? Understanding the effects colors have on you will help you read an artwork and develop your own interpretation of it. And when making your own artwork, knowing the effect colors have will help you control the messages you hope to convey.
Boom, boom. So some quick little slideshow situation on color theory. So, I'm not going to go into this, but color is, I will go into a little bit of this. Color is light. So Isaac Newton discovered this in the 1600s, how light is broken up when it goes through a prism, right? You get that all those different rainbow of fruit flavors. So what is that color? These things kind of always blew my mind. You're not going to be tested on this, but color is interesting. It's like when light hits an object, it's absorbed while when light hits an object, some light is absorbed while other light is reflected. This reaction creates color. So when all the light rays are absorbed, it's black. So if everything's absorbed, boom, it's black. When all the light rays are reflected back, it's white. So even though water's blue or green, that sun hits it, you get that reflection of the white. One ray is reflected, example red, that the object will appear that color. So kind of like the green leaf, everything's hitting it. All those colors are absorbed except the green is what your eye sees. This is what I'm not going to go into. Rods and cones and the way your eye sees color. It's really interesting, as far as like the way the human body and human eye works. Rods and cones. So The other big interesting thing is color blindness. So I'm just curious if anyone doesn't see that 12, you could possibly be colorblind. And I don't know if you see that 26 or this kind of squiggly snake that goes through. And this is the classic one that where a lot of people see color blindness because they don't see reds and greens. They would see all of that as brown, kind of a brownish. So if you don't see a pattern where my cursor is going of like a reddish pink and orange going through a sea of greens, then you probably are colorblind. So you should know that. Claude Monet was an impressionist painter whose subject was color and light. He painted the same subjects repeatedly. Here, the Houses of Parliament in London captured different colors created by the weather and atmosphere. So, these same, and this is kind of what you're doing. This is why I'm telling you, this is the same image, but done throughout different seasons, throughout different times of the day, and you get these different emotions or feelings out of it. Like that feels very like late August hazy to me, and this feels very wintry to me. You know what I mean? So those kind of emotions through color. Color is affected by context. So these shades of pink are the same from left to right, but they appear differently depending on how your eye sees it. So it's always interesting. I sometimes will do this game where I look like at different colors like this, where you can cover one. But this same pink here and here, it's very vibrant here, whereas it's almost like the muted one over here. Whereas this is the darkest one on this side, but it's kind of muted because of the black background. It doesn't stand out as much. The color wheel. So here's old Isaac Newton again. It was the first color wheel. It was created by him in 1666. There are a number of color combinations that are considered aesthetically pleasing, and they typically consist of two or more colors with a fixed relation color. So let's talk about that. Primaries. Primaries are red, yellow, and blue. So the red, we get the yellow and the blue. They make that triangle, right, that we call the primaries. Everything, you can't mix those. Like those exist. That's what all colors are mixed from. Secondaries are mixed when you do, yellow and blue make green, and yellow and red make orange. That orange is a secondary color. But then you mix the secondary color and another secondary color, and that's how you get tertiary colors: red orange, red purple, purple blue, et cetera, et cetera. But everything's based off those primaries. But then there's tints and shades, and they talked about this. Tints, you add white to anything, and it's going to tint it. It's going to make it brighter. Shades are when you darken it. You add black. So that's just a language that we use in art. You're going to tint it, like when you're in painting class, you're like, oh, you need to tint it, or you need to shade it a little bit. So pretty clear, light or dark, white or black. Mono, one, chroma, color, monochromatic, same color throughout, one color with white, and you can dark and black, and you can darken and lighten throughout the whole thing and get an entire image or a lot of range out of one single hue. Hue, H-U-E, which is just a fancy name for color. Monochromatic painting. Warm and cool, which is what we're doing. These are all warm over here, and these are all cool. You get a little bit into these zones in here, like, oh, is green warm or is it cool? Well, there's yellow-green and there's kind of blue-green. So green's one of those ones, as is, purple. I think about purple as cool, but sometimes like you look at a fire and there's a little bit of orangey redness, purplishness in there, and it's like kind of crosses between the warm and cool. So just know as you do your painting, there's some leeway in there. Clearly very cool. Monochromatic cool, and it has like that mood of like depressed or low light, wintry. Even though there is warm colors in here, the predominant feature is cool in this. The atmosphere is cool. It feels like winter. It feels chilly. It doesn't feel hot, even though there is red and orange in that. Whereas this feels more warm to me. It's a classic orange, red, yellow kind of warm color field. These ones always throw me off. This one's like, is this warm or cool? Yellow is very warm. The green is in the cool side, but I would say, strangely, this is still a very warm painting for me because the yellow is predominant and the green is more of a yellow green, if you think about it or look at it. Complementaries are right across from each other on the color wheel. So yellow and blue, like Christmas colors, red and green, those are complementary. They look very vibrant. They'll make your image stand out. It's almost like obnoxious, and that's why a lot of sports teams use that, because you can see like the colors from across the, from way far away. They make the letters pop out very much so against each other. A lot of advertising uses this. You start to, you're in the airport and you see all the magazines or whatever. Start to think about like a lot of times there'll be like an oceanic background, a lot of blues, and they'll use orange for their like titles because it really stands out and pops against that background because they're trying to draw your eye in. Analogous, fancy word. They're right next to each other. Any three that are next to each other. So if this was your middle, the analogous color scheme would be this. If this was your middle, the analogous color scheme would be this. They work really well together. Typically, it's pleasing to the eye to see like this color combination. It's not jarring or obnoxious. So analogous. Triadic, I'm not going to get into too much of this, but it's working across from each other. That's usually a good color scheme. Like if you're like, oh, I really want to use red, a lot of my painting is red. How can I make it pop, or this or that, or what's a good balanced, painting? Well, throwing in a little blue and a little yellow ends up like, having the full triadic blend. Those pop because, and again, it's a graphic design thing because they really stand out against each other. They work well together. And, clearly these are things that you've seen that they make your brain recognize certain imagery or certain colors have symbolicness. I'm not going to go into split complementary. That's like collegey crazy stuff. And tetradic. I mean, you can look into this stuff if you want. I mean, this is like color theory craziness, but this is like this is something that we are going to be thinking about with your warm and cool, because it's really like a winter summer kind of thing or somewhere blended in. And this is like a seasonal painting. If you took a college painting class, it's pretty classic to like do a seasonal painting. So you've got your monochromatic, analogous, triadic, complementary, and this works really well for, I would say, winter, spring, summer, fall, and maybe, I don't know, could that be fall? I would say that's more spring for me. So those are, usually really good ways for your objects to stand out. Color mixing. This is interesting. This is an artist named Chuck Close, and it's just a little bit of an example of how your eyes naturally blend. But if you went close, it's just these blobs, right? But it's kind of like pixels when you step back from a cartoon or like a newspaper, but you get really close and you see all the little dots. It's our eye puts that together and it blends the colors naturally, even though that's like an aggressive orange versus a yellow versus this kind of pinkish skin tone. It blends it all when you step back from it. Your eye blends it. And this is, the people have been doing this for a while. This is Seurat from, hundreds of years ago. And he does pointillism. He's known for like, instead of like drawing, he basically dot, 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 dots. He's an artist that used a lot of dot, dot, dots, all throughout his paintings. And then, like I said, sort of back to like these ones right here, boop, boop, symbolic color. Like you think about that when you see these colors. Well, it's the same with, different symbolic color that you see here. And this is just an interesting test of the eye. So while I'm reading this, look at this white dot really closely. This is an example of how an after image shows the way your eye sees color. The flag shown below is complementary colors to the normal American flag. Stare at the white dot in the center of the flag for about 10 seconds, then click forward to the next slide to see, and continue to stare at the black dot. So look at that white dot really closely. Let's try and be still. Boom. And then it has that after haze. Did you guys see that? So if you look, I'll do it one more time. Kind of, for me, I always see this haze, like sort of the after haze. So this is like a little eye test. So I stare at it. 5, 4, 3, 2, boom. And you see the after haze, and then it fades as you blink, it goes away. You see that little haze of like color left over? Just the way your eye sees. Color emphasis. So certain colors, especially red, will like draw your eye in. I look at this, bam, my eye directly goes to that red. Just interesting as a color theory, emphasis. When it's in color, your eye is drawn to the red. But when it becomes a black and white painting, my eye is drawn more to the white, right? So it's wild how hues, tints, I'll just read this. But when you see the painting in black and white, the white spot draws your attention. The value of the red spot becomes a middle gray and almost disappears. So yeah, like this becomes just like part of the background, whereas back here is really popping. It just changes with color. Color is something that you can use for emphasis, like the way my eye is drawn to the middle here and his or her red coat, jacket, whatever. And then balance. Like I look at this, again, it's just a little eye test. It's like that red is so strong that it's almost I would say it's as powerful as the square on the right, even though this is much larger in scale. The red seems just as much weight in a painting, a drawing. And then, like before, it's kind of like what we were just working on our last landscape. Anything that's closer to you, especially colors, are going to be brighter and more saturated. As you go into the distance, you can see how things get more fuzzy and faded. And this is a good trick because you're doing a landscape here in this next piece. But things that are further away get more soft, more blue, atmospheric perspective. And the closer they get to you, the more detail and the more crisp and the more tight and the more bright your colors get. Same with this, like that hazy background back here, but as it gets closer, a lot more detail. And then this is interesting, is the painting does not follow any of those rules. The scene has an even saturation in the background and the foreground, and it makes this look flat and less realistic. It's just a style choice, but if you don't use atmospheric perspective, your stuff is going to look flat, and just flat. Same with this Cezanne painting. And that's kind of all for the slides. So, all right, watercolor paintings. Let's talk about it. The ability to use, I want to make this big. The ability of color schemes to dramatically change the mood of an image is apparent in these suites by Claude Monet in the 1840s, he was born in 1840 to 1926. These depict the matter of the ruined cathedral below and the Houses of Parliament in London and the haystacks at different times of the day. Look closely to see all the different schemes after the images. So, I mean, these are all kind of what we're doing. Like if I was going to say like, oh, do a warm and a cool, like this would be the warm and that could be the cool. Or, I'm sorry, this could be the warm and that could be the cool. Or this could be the warm and that could be the cool. For this assignment, you're going to be creating two versions of the same painting in the spirit of Monet. One warm, one cool. First, you must find or draw an image of a landscape. It can be simple, super simple, just like your landscape you did on the last one. I'll show you student examples below. You can use a photo. You can use my projector if you want before you leave here today or next week or tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but probably Thursday or Friday. This is going to be your subject for both paintings. You can take or use your own photograph, find an image in a book or magazine, use a previous landscape drawing as a starting point, so you can use this last drawing and use it as the color start. If you're happy with your texture value landscape drawing, you can basically do it in color on this one, or just even a little area of it that you love. Sketch your image in pencil on 2 pieces of paper, which I have provided in your packet, and they are special watercolor paper. And you make sure that you find that watercolor paper, and you should be able to tell. I'll show you, but it's thicker and it has a little bit of a grit or a tooth, we call it, on the front. One side's kind of glossy, the other side has a little bit of texture, and that's because it's watercolor paper. It's made to absorb watercolors really nicely. And you're going to create that composition, one with red and orange and yellow, and the others with the cool, the green, blue, violet. Remember, craftsmanship is always important, and we're going to not leave any white space. Process like I just talked about. Sketch it out. Pro tip, try turning your reference photo and drawing upside down. By drawing the shapes upside down, it helps you recreate them more accurately, actually. Trace or redraw that onto another piece of paper so they both are the same. Now start adding in the color, right? Photograph the 2 images from above so we see the whole image together, just like these ones. So when you submit it, it will be one image, them right next to each other. Bam, bam. right? So warm, cool, pretty clear. So quick and dirty watercolor tips. Woo! I don't know.
We're going to be painting a simple landscape in watercolor, and we're going to be using basically one color to do it. This is a very, very good beginning tutorial, very simple. I've just put tape around my paper to make it a little bit easier for me to have some edges and to create a frame. So I'm just using a bigger brush and I'm just making a big puddle of water in my tray because I'm going to first paint the background, which would be, if you're looking at a landscape, it would be the sky. And the landscape we're going to be painting is as if we were sitting on a mountain looking down at the valley or other mountains. So I'm going to use a little bit of blue. Come on, blue.
None of this is
now,
required,
this
but
is
these are
going to
good
be something
tips.
that's furthest away from it. This is going to be the lightest and the dullest color. So as things move further away from us, they get a little
I'll say
bit duller.
this. I watch my daughters paint with watercolor all the time, and they just dip their papers right in here and go right to the page. And then they try and like fill it in like it's dark paint. You know what I mean? And watercolors are meant to be doing what she's doing on the right here. They're meant to be watery and thin. This is a great way just to get a start on your piece. I would push it way further than she does, but you'll see what we're talking about.
A little bit bluer, and that is called atmospheric perspective. So to make this a little bit duller, you could add a few different colors to it. I'm going to add a little bit of orange. It's going to kind of turn it into a gray. You might want to just test it on a paper towel to make sure it's the color that you want. So I'll usually just brush it on there and say, oh, or another piece of watercolor paper that works too. And then you're going to paint in your sky. To get a flat wash, I like to actually have my paper vertical, not on a table, but this will still work. It's kind of hard to get used to painting that way. You just want to make sure you can go back in lightly in places, but you don't want to scrub your paper. Scrubbing would be if I kept going back and forth, and eventually it would rub right through your paper. If you get bunches of water, you can just dry off your brush a little bit and just drag it over that area. So after you get this layer done, you need to let it dry before you add the second layer. Okay, now once it's dry, you can tell it's dry because it's not going to be shiny anymore. If you made a mistake like I did right here, just cover it up with the foreground later, or maybe even your middle ground. So I'm just adding a little bit more blue to my puddle, and a little bit more orange, and I am going to lightly paint in some mountains that are going to be back here. These are mountains in my head. Well, just like I did before, I'm going to let this dry before I start the next layer. For this next step, I've added a little bit more blue to my puddle, and I'm just going to make one more mountain range before I paint the mountain that we are on. Okay, once this is dried, you can go ahead and paint in your foreground. I'm making my puddle just a little bit bigger, not too much. And I'm going to add a lot of blue and just a touch of orange. So I'm going to paint a hill coming down here, and then maybe starting to come up on that side. If it bothers you, because you can kind of see those mountains through this, you can make this color a tiny bit darker and brighter and go back over it. Okay, once the last layer you painted is dried, you're going to go ahead and paint in the foreground, which is going to be some pine trees. You want to make sure, though, that you use a ton of blue and make sure you're letting each layer dry in between. And if you make a mistake, like I did, it's okay. Just figure out a way to incorporate it or add something over the top of it. So I'm going to start with this pine tree right here, and I'm going to start at the very, very bottom. And I'm just going to make this kind of bushy pine needles.
There's no right or wrong here, and I hope that everybody kind of comes up with their own solution to this problem, essentially.
There's that without the reflection. Okay, so now I'm just going to paint a smaller pine tree right here next to this one. Okay, and then you can add some darker areas in there if you want some shadows. It ends up looking like a monochromatic painting, or a painting where you just use one color. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I've had a lot of people ask about how to paint landscapes.
Just like really, you could see, the clear thing there was same color, palette, but she darkened it, which created that atmospheric perspective. And can you and should you? I thought that one of the best things about that too was going back in with the tree there in the end. Or the trees, that just gives like something right in front of you, and then you get some nice depth out of it too. I'm not going to show this whole video, but there's a couple things this guy did I thought was pretty cool.
Good morning and welcome back to the Gilbert Lin's YouTube channel. So today's video is going to be the start of that time I just gave it a crack. Without further, I'll be using 300 GSM cold press watercolor paper for this tutorial. Now you'll need some paint. You can use disc cakes, watercolor tubes, or even watercolor pans. It's up to you. For this video, I'll be using Winsor & Newton's Cotman watercolor pans. Watercolor is a water-based medium, so these dried pans or cakes need a bit of water applied to activate the paint. It's recommended to lightly wet the pans before use, or even misting them lightly with the spray bottle. Next, you'll need some brushes. Different brushes have different effects and purposes,
two brushes,
so I'll go through these
yet.
in another video,
medium and a
as
small.
they're specific brush heads suitable for watercolor. For now, any brush will do. Next, grab some paper towel or tissue paper, or even a spare piece of paper, that will do. This will be used to dry off your wet brushes and wipe away excess water, and even sampling colours before you apply them to your work. Lastly, you'll need to grab a cup or jar of some sort. Make that two, and fill them with water. One will be for dirty water and paint, and the other will be for clean water. Try get into this habit as early as possible, otherwise you'll end up like me who constantly mixes them up. The purpose of having clean water is so that when you go to apply watercolor, the color will come out a lot clearer, brighter, and stronger, as opposed to using dirty water, which often makes colors murky and muddy. Now let's start off with some basics. For now, we'll talk about only two different types of watercolor brush techniques that you can use. There's wet on wet and wet on dry. These are two techniques that you can use to paint for starters, and eventually you can start to mix them up even and use them both to create awesome effects once you understand how they work and their advantages. First, let's look at wet on wet techniques. The technique is when you apply wet paint onto a wet surface. So for this first example, what we're going to do is wet the surface of the paper generously. With the water still wet and beady, let's apply a generous amount of paint. And that's the effect you get. The paint slowly disperses into the area and shape which you painted with water, and eventually it dries up to stain the paper and create a soft effect. While the paint is still wet, you actually can continue to work the paint a bit more into the paper, so you can do bleeds and even gradient effects. Next, we're going to use a more subtle effect of wet on wet techniques. First, apply some water and spread it onto the surface with a brush so that the paper soaks it in a bit. Apply a bit of paint and voila! It's a fanning effect. The paint spreads out to wherever the paper has been wet, so it creates this interesting effect. But the best thing about it is that it's easy to blend colours, because while the paper and paint is still wet, you can easily work the paint to blend and create gradients. The next technique we look at is wet on dry. It's where we apply wet paint onto dry surfaces. The advantage here is that you can use the paint to create bold, strong colours in defining shape and forms. Basically, it's great for outlining and creating detail. Lastly, we're going to be using a combination of both techniques. So the more you get used to watercolor and experimenting with it, you start being able to mix and use both techniques. Here, I'm using wet on wet first to create the soft bleeding effect, and then wet on dry to create the fine details. You can even apply wet on dry first, and then rework the paint while it's still wet with clean water, so that the effect eventually becomes more wet on wet technique. This way you get the best of both worlds, of sharp details and subtle blending. I'll go through these techniques in more detail in a future video, but for now let's use the knowledge and apply it in creating a portrait. First, with watercolor, the rule is that
short, but it's just interesting. What I like about this guy is he's not just, coloring one big splotch of color, but you can see the variety that you can get, and those are just super simple tricks, and he's doing them right there. Getting your paper wet first will make it bleed. That's really great for like skies, backgrounds, things you want muddy, and then as you get closer towards yourself, you can, clean it up. And the other thing is I want to say about him and your piece, you're artists, and I really value variety and being expressive and trying new things and experimenting. If you go back in with Sharpies or pencil into your drawings, tighten things up, I think that's awesome. And you'll see, I'll show those images of student work one more time, and there's a lot of variety that they have. And you do not need to do this technique either, where they put down the tape. It's just really nice. Don't use just any old tape. Use masking tape, because otherwise it'll rip your edges. And if you have any of that painter's blue tape at your home, that's even smarter, the kind that they use to paint houses or whatever. But just to see these up close is nice, and the variety of darks and lights of the hues. I just thought he has some simple techniques it can be the wet on wet and the dry on dry can be really nice. So again, one last time looking at student work, you can see some is very wet on wet, kind of like they're more bleeding with some nice tighter trees in the foreground. She did a whole like sort of color scheme background and then did these in black in the foreground, which are, I don't know if they're kind of they're fireworks or they're like palm trees, but dandelions. There you go. See, now you're right. They are. They're like super close up. And the same thing, just looking at these and looking at the brights, not just one color. What I would like about this is they went back in and added a little dark. It's not just one color, but it's got that variety. And that makes my eye think like, oh, deep. And there are the crevices and nooks and crannies of all those mountains. And then can you mix colors? Does it have to stay within? The predominant feature has to be that color, warm and cool. But there's still cool or warm colors in this cool color painting and vice versa. So you can use the other colors. Just be wise, make it awesome, make them beautiful, make them rich. That's the thing. See if I can stop this Castify. The bottom left.